first time they saw her stacking those hay bales in a wide, strange circle, the ranch hands called her everything from fool to witch. By dusk, one of them had bet a bottle of whiskey that the whole thing would catch fire in the first week of frost. But the woman they jeered at, Miriam Cole, never looked up, not once. Her gloves were ragged, her dress patched and frostbitten at the hem, and her back ached from weeks of hauling. But her children were shivering in a house that had no proper insulation, and the wind was biting deeper each night. She didn't need anyone's permission. She needed warmth. By the time December came, the Wyoming Valley had turned white and mean. Cold like that didn't just creep, it hunted. And Miriam's cabin sat in the open, battered by prairie wind that howled from the mountains down like a curse. It rattled the windows, pushed its fingers through every wall crack, and made her 3 boys curl up so tight they looked like laundry tucked in corners. Each night she'd wake with ice in her lashes, her breath curling around the rafters like ghosts of what little warmth had been there hours before. That's when she started stacking the bales. She didn't ask, she didn't explain. She simply walked the 2 miles to the McKinley place where they were selling hay by the load, and she dragged one back every day on the busted old sled her husband had left behind. She bartered when she could: 3 eggs, a jar of molasses, a torn pair of boots she'd sewn with twine. Other days, she just begged. Folks laughed the first week, then they started to whisper. "She's building a fence made of kindling," they said. "She's gonna bury those boys in hay when it all collapses under snow. Crazy old widow. Don't know the first thing about windbreaks." But what they didn't see was what Miriam knew deep in her bones. That wind, not snow, was the killer. You could shovel snow, you could melt it for water, but wind stripped heat out of walls like knives scraping marrow from bone. And so she built, not against snow, against wind. The first bale went 10 feet from the cabin wall, then another, and another, in a rough circle, wide enough for a horse to walk between the hay and the house. Not too close. That was key. She wanted a cushion, a space for the wind to be caught, to slow, to stall. She'd read something once, long ago, before the wagon train days, before the cholera took her husband outside of Laramie, some settler's journal. Snow drifts against windbreaks, save the warmth within. That phrase had haunted her. Each bale took nearly a day to get, drag, and place. It took 3 weeks before the circle was complete. More of a lopsided ring, really, with a few small gaps where she'd run out of twine and used cut saplings to brace the stacks. The final count was 38 bales, nearly chest high, wound like a protective wall against the white prairie and its bitter roar. And then came the freeze. It was sharp, sudden. Even old-timers were caught off guard. On December 18th, the sky went from steel gray to blinding white in hours. The wind rolled in like a living thing, rattling the church steeple so hard the cross snapped off. Trees cracked like gunfire. Chickens froze solid on perches. Even inside, it was so cold that tin cups stuck to lips and fingers split just from holding a broom. But inside Miriam Cole's cabin, something changed. The temperature dropped, yes, but not the same way it had before. The boys still huddled near the stove, but they weren't weeping in their sleep. Frost formed at the windows, but didn't spread like ivy across the walls. The water bucket only half froze. And in the morning, when the sun rose and the wind screamed like devils around the homestead, she stepped out to fetch wood and realized something strange. There was no wind inside the circle. Not dead still, but muffled, like stepping inside a church. She could feel it, like the world had gone quiet, like a soft hand on her ears. Snow had drifted up against the bales, clean and curved like the side of a white fort. Inside the circle, the air felt different, less angry, less wild. The front of the cabin had no icicles on it, no frozen crust at the corners. Her breath still fogged, but she didn't need to pull her shawl up around her ears just to last 10 seconds outside. She didn't need to measure the degrees to know what she'd done, but she did anyway. Each night she kept a pencil beside the stove and marked the inside temperature on a piece of barnwood. She'd bought a tiny mercury thermometer from a traveling tinker last autumn, before she knew she'd be alone this winter, and she used it like a holy object. After 3 nights, the truth was plain. It was staying, on average, nearly 40 degrees warmer inside than it had been before the bales. 40. Enough to keep the beans from freezing in the pantry. Enough to keep the boys from waking with blue fingers. Enough to make one of them, Nathan, the youngest, laugh in his sleep. A real laugh, the kind you thought winter had killed. And still, the neighbors mocked. Word spread, of course. Nothing stayed secret in a place like that. Men on horseback came by to check in, which meant they were hoping to catch her admitting it was all a disaster. One asked asked if she'd started smoking the hay for warmth. Another said the whole thing looked like a giant rat's nest. 40 degrees warmer, she said flatly, arms crossed. Cabin don't whistle at night anymore. But they just grinned and rode off, swearing to themselves. It didn't make sense. That's why they couldn't accept it. It wasn't a chimney, wasn't a new stove, wasn't lumber or stone or iron. It was hay, cheap, simple hay, stacked with care and stubbornness. They didn't believe it. But 2 weeks later, when a widow named Jessamine Carver showed up on Miriam's doorstep in tears, saying her roof had caved and the baby wouldn't stop coughing, Miriam didn't hesitate. She cleared a space by the stove, fed them soup, laid the baby down beside her own boys. That was the first. By New Year's, there were 7 more. Some came with excuses, said they'd just passing through or needed to rest their mule. But they stayed, because inside that circle, inside that little miracle of hay and stubborn willpower, there was heat, real, livable, steady heat. One old trapper, nearly blind with frostbite, cried when he sat near the fire and felt his toes again. "This ain't a cabin," he whispered. "It's a lifeboat." Outside, the valley howled and cracked and burned white under the cruel sky. Inside, they stayed warm. Snow fell like ash through January. Not the soft kind, not the drifting dance from children's tales, but a heavy, wet suffocation that clung to everything. It blanketed the hills in silence, buried cabins in white tombs, and muffled the world until even the sound of your own breath felt swallowed. It was the kind of winter that aged a man 5 years in a month, and it hadn't let up once since New Year's Eve. Inside the cabin, Miriam Cole kept watch. By the stove, she sat with a cracked notebook on her knees, the same page folded and unfolded a dozen times where she'd drawn the crude layout of the hay circle. The numbers next to it told their own tale. Night after night, the temperatures she scribbled stayed steady. 35 degrees warmer some nights, 42 on others. The insulation from the hay combined with the break in wind and the packed snow around the bales only hardened them further, like frozen walls wrapped in silence. The little fire she managed each night, burning only a log or two, suddenly went twice as far. And the people inside, they changed too. The cabin was only meant for 4. Now it held 12. Miriam didn't have enough beds, so she laid down thick quilts on the pine floor, stacked hay from the leftover bales near the hearth, and packed it in sacks, made crude mats from the discarded feed sacks, and stuffed them with dry grass. The air in the cabin carried the sharp mix of wood smoke, sweat, and damp wool. But there was laughter now, quiet at first, like some fragile bird learning to sing again after being buried under ice. The baby Jessamine had carried in, little Clara, began to stir without that hollow cough. Her cheeks, once grey with cold, began to show pink. A miner named Tucker, fingers blackened with frostbite from a failed ride east, managed to grip a cup of broth without crying. And Miriam's boys, for the first time in weeks, asked for seconds. Outside, the hay circle stood like a fortress. The wind howled but could not penetrate. Neighbors who passed through stared, confused. The snow piled up against the bales, yes, but it added to the protection. Where other roofs cracked and caved from the weight, Miriam's stood untouched. She'd braced it back in October with thick beams, and now, with no direct wind pressure slamming its sides, the snow simply sat there, heavy but harmless. Miriam had created something she never meant to build, a kind of haven, a fluke, some would say, a fluke born of desperation, stubbornness, and a memory half-remembered from a settler's journal. But not everyone was pleased. 2 days after the third family arrived, a gaunt-faced mother and her 2 boys from over the ridge, there came a knock. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the shy tap of someone asking for shelter. It was a hard knock. The door creaked open and in stepped Levi Carson, rancher, teamster, a man with boots heavy enough to crush a coyote's spine, and a voice twice as cruel. He didn't bother shaking off the snow. "I heard you're running a charity barn," he muttered, eyes scanning the inside. "Or a circus." Miriam didn't move. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood near the fire. Her fingers ached from shelling beans all morning. "I heard you were laughing about my hay circle 2 weeks ago," she said. He smirked. "I was, until half the town started begging to sleep in it." He stepped inside, slow, boots thudding against the floorboards. "You letting anyone in now? Or just the ones who sob loudest?" Miriam didn't blink. "I let in anyone whose breath I can still see." Carson spat into the fire. It hissed. "You're making the rest of us look weak." There it was. Truth always came out bitter. "You mean," she said, folding her arms, "I'm making it harder for men who wouldn't lift a finger for their neighbor to keep pretending they're the strong ones." Silence spread like oil. No one in the room moved. The baby even stopped babbling. Carson stepped forward once. "That hay you bought from McKinley, you didn't pay for half of it. You traded junk." "I paid what I could," she said, "and I'll pay the rest when I have it." It was spoken for. She met his eyes steady. "You laughed when I hauled the first bale. You laughed when I hauled the 10th. You didn't say a damn word until it worked. Carson turned on his heel. You're stealing heat from God's own justice, widow. He left without closing the door, and that night, someone slashed 4 of the outer bales with a hunting knife. The damage wasn't enough to destroy the circle, but it was a warning, a line drawn in the snow. Miriam spent the morning before dawn restacking and patching the cuts with twine and saplings. The boys helped without asking. No one mentioned it. After that, Miriam started rotating watch at night. It was strange how quickly everyone adapted. Even the trapper with the frostbitten hands offered to take shifts sitting near the window, watching the perimeter through the snow swirl. They made spears from fence wood and hung a rusted cowbell near the door. If anyone approached, the bell would ring. That next week, 3 more came. No one asked where they were from, just lost, cold, on foot. A girl barely 16, clothes soaked and toes black. A man with half a beard frozen solid. A woman in her 50s who'd tried to sleep in her root cellar and nearly died from smoke inhalation after the fire choked her out. They came and they stayed. Each new arrival was given the same: a blanket, a bowl of stew, and silence. It was an unspoken rule now. You didn't ask how someone got here. You didn't ask what they'd left behind. You just kept the fire going, shared what you had, and rotated the watch. By the middle of January, the hay circle had become more than insulation. It had become a message, and people noticed. A letter came by sled from the town of Braxton's Fork, written in a quivering hand and tied with blue yarn. It simply said, "Our church roof collapsed. My children are sleeping in the bell tower. I heard what you did. Please tell me how." Miriam read the letter aloud. No one spoke for a long time. Then she got out her old notebook and tore out the pages. Drew the circle again, simple and crude. Wrote measurements, bale count, placement, distance from the cabin, snowdrift lines, where to leave the stove for best efficiency. She sealed it in oilskin and sent it back with the sled team. That was the first of 5 letters. A week later, a man rode up on a mule and offered her his last 2 chickens if he could trace the circle on his own land. Another brought her a spool of copper wire in exchange for letting him walk the perimeter and take notes. Still, Levi Carson watched from his ranch on the ridge. He never sent letters, but his men stopped by twice. Once to ask about bale stacking, once to drop off a few crates of old nails and chopped wood, claiming it was extra. It was not extra, and it wasn't mercy. By the end of January, something had shifted. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a defiance, a quiet revolution wrapped in hay and snow and steam rising from a battered iron pot. And then came the storm. Not wind, not the usual. This was a whiteout, a 3-day siege. Snow fell so hard and fast that even the horses in the barn lost track of their own bodies. You couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. Trees bent until they split. Sled runners vanished under drifts. The smoke from the chimney couldn't rise. It just flattened and slid away. Inside the cabin, they went quiet. There were now 16 people living in the space meant for 4. Miriam rationed firewood to a science. 1 log every 4 hours. Wet socks were hung near the ceiling in a line. Condensation froze and dripped from the rafters. People slept in shifts to keep body heat up. No one cried. No one dared. And still, inside the hay circle, they survived. The fire never died. The walls never cracked. The heat never fled. By the 3rd night, the storm ended. The sun returned. And with it came the visitors. People who had huddled in barns, who had burned furniture to stay alive, who had buried their livestock just to reach their own doors. They came, pale and hollow, to stare at the cabin wrapped in gold. Because in the sunlight, the hay circle didn't look like a joke anymore. When the storm broke and the light returned, the land didn't move. It simply was, still, exhausted. Snow sat in jagged drifts like white boulders scattered across the prairie. Fence posts vanished. Trails were erased. The mountains in the distance seemed to float on the sky, their base swallowed by the sea of white that had claimed everything lower. Wind no longer howled. It whispered now, as if too tired to raise its voice. And in the center of it all, Miriam Cole's cabin stood untouched, ringed by hay now hardened with ice and crusted snow. The circle was uneven, sagging in parts, pocked where people had walked too close or leaned against it during watch shifts, but it still held, and what it held inside was more than just a warm room. It was life. No one had frozen, no one had died, and that was more than most homesteads could say. Word had spread fast, too fast. By the end of the week, people came from places even Miriam didn't recognize. Couples, travelers, and families on foot, wearing every stitch of clothing they owned. Some pulled carts, others carried children in sacks across their backs. Some had heard by letter, others by mouth, others by miracle. They didn't come for handouts, they came to understand. It started small. One man circled the hay wall 3 times before finally asking if he could draw it. A mother traced it in snow with her boot. A carpenter from Split Creek squatted down and tapped the packed snow near the bales, nodding like he'd discovered some ancient ruin. They all had the same question in their eyes. Why does this work? And Miriam didn't give them an answer, not right away, because she didn't know how to explain what she had done. It wasn't science, it wasn't magic, it was grief. It was the kind of grief that strips everything away except what keeps your children alive, the kind that teaches you to trade pride for hay bales and shame for an extra 10 degrees of warmth, the kind that makes you remember some scribbled phrase from a long-dead settler's book while your fingers bleed tying twine in the cold. Eventually, she started to speak. One by one, she told them, "You leave a gap between the bales and the cabin, wide enough to walk, too close and snow drifts push on the walls, too far, and wind slips through. You stack 'em chest high, then brace the corners with greenwood so they don't sag. You let the snow pack up on the outside. Don't brush it off. It's insulation once it sets." And always, she ended the same way. This wasn't about building a wall. It was about breaking the wind. They listened. They took notes. They offered barter, axes, dried meat, leather scraps. But she didn't ask for payment. Instead, she gave them something else. She started copying her instructions onto pages from her old seed catalogue, ripped them out, wrote between the pictures of tomatoes and corn, drew rough diagrams, folded them carefully and wrapped them in waxed paper. By the end of February, she had given out 27 such packets. The strange thing was, no one laughed anymore. Not the ranchers, not the men who had mocked her hay fence, not even Levi Carson. He rode by once after the big storm, didn't dismount, just stared from atop his mare, face shaded under a wool hat. "You built a fortress out of cow food," he finally said. Miriam was splitting kindling. She didn't look up. "It worked." He nodded once, and that was all. He turned the horse and left. But days later, someone told her he'd started stacking bales around his bunkhouse. As the thaw began, slow and hesitant, the cabin transformed again. Not because of the walls, but because of what was now inside them. It was no longer a shelter. It was a school, a forge, a church. She found herself hosting 3 carpenters from different valleys. They slept in shifts, and by day spent hours debating wind paths and thermal retention. One of them offered to dig her a root cellar that wouldn't flood in spring. Another fixed her sagging stovepipe, added a reflector plate behind the flame. They cooked together, stirred lard into oats to make it stick longer in the belly. They built a rack outside to dry extra wood, using it to catch late-season sun. They boiled pine needles for vitamin C. The trapper, old Donley, began teaching boys how to make snowshoes from willow and rope. Miriam watched this all from the center of her cabin like a mother hen too weary to cluck. She didn't command, she didn't lead, but people followed her anyway, and with every new visitor came stories. Stories of neighbors freezing in their own homes, of a cabin fire started by a wind-split stovepipe, of a man who rode into a creek by mistake because the snow covered the ice, and when they pulled him out, his legs were already gone, of babies buried in cellars to preserve what little warmth their breath could give. And the strangest stories of all, of other hay circles now rising. They said Widow Graves in North Hollow had built a double-layered ring with snow packed between 2 hay rows like mortar. They said someone near Crystal Lake had stacked their hay high and added a crude roof, making a sort of second skin over their cabin. They said a trapper had built his hay wall not to warm his home, but to protect his animals. He claimed his goats hadn't lost a single kid that winter. None of them were laughing now. But not all was peace. As spring crept in, and the snow began to rot at the edges, crusty in the day, refrozen at night. A new kind of danger rose. Resentment. Some of the men who'd refused to believe the hay trick worked were now facing shame from their own families. Their wives pointed at Miriam's cabin with fury. Their sons asked why they hadn't done the same. Their neighbors started asking questions that stung, so they lashed out. The first act was small. Someone knocked down the signpost Miriam's boys had stuck out front, marking wind direction from the last storm. Then someone left a pig carcass inside the hay circle, gutted and half-rotted. A mockery, an insult. Next came the fire. It was March 3rd, still cold, but the sun had thawed the top layer of snow, just enough for footprints to stick. Miriam had just returned from boiling the last of the salted beef when the bell rang. The cowbell on the front hook, sharp, twice. Donley was already moving. He yanked the door open, spear in hand, and saw smoke. One of the hay bales had been lit, the one nearest the barn, farthest from the cabin. The flame wasn't roaring. It was low, smoldering, but the snow that had once packed around it had melted from sun and the edges were dry. Miriam shouted for water. Buckets flew. Snow was shoveled by the armful. They stomped, slapped, cursed. In the end, they put it out, but the smell lingered. Burnt hay, fear and fury. They circled the property. found tracks, big boots, a horse tethered at the tree line. They never saw who it was. Miriam didn't cry, but she did something else. She called everyone into the cabin, 20 people now, all ages, backgrounds, soot-smudged faces, red hands, some still breathing hard from the fire. She looked at each one, then said, "Do we rebuild it?" No one spoke, so she asked again. "Do we rebuild the circle?" Donnelly stepped forward. "We do." Others nodded. One boy raised his hand. The carpenter from Split Creek spit in his palm and offered it, and so they did. They fetched new bales, replaced the burned one, reinforced the others. This time they dug a trench at the base to keep the snow from melting out too soon. They lined the outer rim with ash to make fires harder to catch, and they hung the pig's bones on a post at the edge of the circle, not as warning, as proof they would not be run out. In the days that followed, Miriam did what she hadn't done in months. She wrote a letter, not to any town, not to any sheriff, just a page she folded and nailed to the same post as the bones. It read, "This circle is not yours to break. It is not a miracle. It is not a threat. It is a choice. You could have built one too." She didn't sign it, didn't need to. And from that day on, no one touched the hay wall again, not even Carson, because everyone, every last soul in the valley, knew that whatever you thought about Miriam Cole, her cabin had become the place where winter stopped. Not because of the stove, not because of luck, but because she'd refused to freeze when everyone else waited for someone else to act. And spring was coming, but winter wasn't done yet. Not by a long stretch. Spring teased, but it never came. Not fully, not yet. By the second week of March, the sun began to rise earlier and linger longer, painting the frozen hills in copper and gold, as if apologizing for all the cruelty that came before. But the snow didn't vanish. It shifted, melted on top, crusted beneath, turning the whole valley into a brittle white scab that cracked underfoot. Ice refroze in deeper ruts. Roofs leaked, boots soaked through before noon. Hope arrived, but it was false, a liar's warmth, and then came the sickness. It was Nathan, Miriam's youngest, who coughed first, not the dry throat kind. This was deep, wet, heavy. It rattled inside him, and when he exhaled near the window that morning, blood flecked the glass. Miriam stared at it for a long time. She didn't panic. She wiped it away. She sat him down, brewed pine needle broth thick with honey and clove, wrapped him in all 3 quilts, and told her other sons to keep the fire going, no matter what. But she knew. She'd seen it before, in towns, wagon camps, during the hard winter back in '67. You could hold off the wind. You could outthink the cold. But once sickness took root, it came for everything. 2 days later, 4 others were coughing. 3 were children. One was Jessamine's baby, Clara. The old trapper, Donnelly, tried to help. He boiled moss into tea and burned sage in the corners. The carpenter from Split Creek made steam tents using wet blankets over the stove. They all did what they could, but it was Miriam who bore the weight, because it was her circle, her cabin, her decision to let people in. Each wheeze echoed like a bell in her chest. Each red-spotted rag felt like a verdict. Had she made the wrong choice? Should she have barred the doors, hoarded the heat, told everyone to build their own walls? But every time she asked herself that, the answer came back the same. If she hadn't opened the door, they'd be dead already, and that had to count for something. She worked harder, slept less, brewed root concoctions, rationed even tighter. She made onion poultices, wrapped them in rags and tied them against chests. She soaked cracked lips with bear fat. When Jessamine collapsed, Miriam propped her up in a rocking chair and held Clara against her skin through the night. When the coughing boy's fever broke and he vomited blood, Miriam didn't flinch. She scrubbed the floor with lye and lemon peel and said nothing. But the worst part, the hardest part, was that the hay wall couldn't help. It couldn't stop what lived inside. All winter it had held back the world, but now the enemy was already within the gate. So Miriam did something she never had before. She sent everyone else away, not cruelly, not with anger, just with finality. She stood in the center of the room, chest heaving from hauling water all morning, hair plastered to her forehead, and said, "If you aren't coughing, you need to go." They objected. Of course they did. Some shouted, others wept. One woman dropped to her knees and begged, but Miriam held firm. "Take the knowledge, take the diagrams, build your own walls. If you stay, you might get sick. If you leave, you might stay alive, but I won't trap you here." In the end, 14 left. 2 remained. Donnelly, who said he was too old to build another circle and who'd lived longer than most of the mountains around him, and a girl named Mayra, no older than 15, who had nowhere to go and refused to leave the baby goat she carried in her coat. Miriam let her stay. That night, she collapsed against the wall near the stove. Her hands were raw, knuckles bleeding. She hadn't eaten since morning. Nathan still wheezed in the bedroll behind her, one of her older boys wiping his brow with damp cloth. Donnelly sat across from her, polishing a broken rifle just to keep his hands busy. "You think you did wrong?" he asked. She didn't answer. He leaned forward, voice low. You didn't. I seen more winters than I deserve. This one would have taken me in December if you hadn't opened your door. You built something, Miriam. You built a chance. She stared at the flames. I built a trap. He shook his head. No. You built a bridge. Not your fault what walked across it. But she didn't believe him. Not fully. Because she knew the cost wasn't over. The next day, Clara stopped breathing. Jessamine awoke to silence, reached for the baby, and screamed when she realized the body was cold. Miriam took the child gently, wrapped her in her shawl, didn't speak, didn't cry. She walked her outside, into the hay-ringed yard, and dug a hole herself. Frost still clung to the topsoil. The ground beneath was black and stiff. Her hands bled on the shovel. Her breath came ragged. She buried Clara alone, under a spruce tree just outside the circle. No one followed. That night, no one slept. Grief filled the room like smoke. The next morning, Nathan's fever broke. His cheeks flushed with color again. His hands twitched in sleep. His cough faded from wet to dry. A day later, the coughing boy sat up. The girl with the cracked lips ate 2 whole biscuits. Donnelly said his chest no longer felt like a shotgun shell rattling around. It was too early to call it over. But something had shifted. It wasn't just warmth anymore. It was endurance. And Miriam, though hollow-eyed and grey, had not broken. By the end of March, only patchy snow remained. The hay bales still stood, but the drifts around them had sagged, melted, and split. The earth returned, muddy and unsure of itself, like a dog that had been beaten and no longer knew how to wag. People began returning, one by one, not to stay, but to ask. What exactly had she done? How had it worked? Could it be replicated with reeds, with sod bricks? Could it be made larger? Could it house animals? Miriam gave what she could, but her words were fewer now. She was tired, all the way down. But when the women from Red Valley arrived, 3 of them, faces covered, arms thick with rolls of parchment and maps, Miriam took them in the back, lit a candle, and spread her notes. Across the table, she showed them everything, because she knew then this wasn't just about her. It had never been. This was about what could be done, what no one thought should be done. One circle of hay had withstood the worst freeze in 15 years. One woman, alone, had started something that now echoed across the territory. Others were copying it, refining it, improving it. They were building not just warmth, but resilience. It had cost her dearly. But not everything is measured in what you keep. Some things are measured in what survives after you're gone. And Miriam Cole wasn't gone yet. That evening she walked the circle again, bare boots in wet snow, thin coat wrapped tight. The hay smelled sweet now, moist and rich and almost spring-like. She paused at the burned bale from before. You could still see the blackened streak, even beneath the patched new layer. She ran her hand along it, then looked back at the cabin. Smoke curled from the stovepipe. A chicken clucked from the lean-to. Someone inside was laughing, quiet but real, and Miriam smiled, not because it was over, but because it wasn't. Because now, she knew they'd made it this far. And tomorrow, that was a new kind of fight. By April, the valley looked unrecognizable, not because the snow was gone. Patches of it still clung to shaded gullies and northern slopes like bruises that hadn't yet faded, but because of what had risen in its place, circles everywhere, some made of hay, others stacked from sod, bark, even scrap wood or loose stone. It was as if the land itself had adopted Miriam Cole's strange invention, mimicking her crude design in scattered, awkward ways like the first attempts of children trying to write a new letter in a forgotten alphabet. People had taken what she'd done and made it theirs, but still they came. She gave no easy answers. She sat on the porch, hands in her lap, and said softly, I buried 1 husband to disease and nearly buried 3 boys to frost. The first one I couldn't help. The second, I refused to stand by. The journalist asked her name 3 times, writing it in large letters. Miriam Cole. That was the first time she'd seen her name written in someone else's hand in years. The story spread, of course, beyond the territory. Papers in Cheyenne and Dodge printed summaries of the miracle ring of hay. Some called it folk ingenuity. Others called it prairie superstition. One even suggested it had religious meaning, that the circle had somehow protected her like a halo protects a saint. Miriam laughed when Donnelly read that part out loud. A saint? She said, shaking her head. I curse too much for that, and I've buried too many to believe in halos. Still, people came, and with them came stories of other ideas. One couple from Kansas showed her their diagram of a double circle system, with trenches between each to catch runoff and channel spring melt. Another man brought a folded oilcloth, blueprint for a circular barn using the same concept, claiming it kept his sheep alive with half the usual feed. A widow from the Black Hills came carrying a newborn wrapped in a coat lined with cedar shavings and asked if Miriam would bless her own hay circle. Miriam refused. "I'm not a priest," she said, "just a woman who was too cold to wait for permission." But still, she gave the woman tea and warmth and instructions. The land began to wake in earnest as April crawled into May. The snow melted for good, rivers swelled, the ground grew greedy again, pulling roots downward like it had something to prove, and the hay began to rot. That was the thing no one wanted to talk about. Hay wasn't meant to last forever. It was protection, not permanence. The bottom layers had darkened first, damp, moldy. Insects nested in the soft spots. Mice found their way in. The entire ring sagged like an old man's shoulders, and the sweet smell of dried grass turned to sour earth. It had served its purpose, and now it was time to let it go. But Miriam hesitated, not because she didn't understand. She did. Nature reclaims. Nothing stays dry and strong and golden forever. But the thought of tearing it down, it felt like erasing something sacred. This wall had held the line. This wall had watched her cry, cough, bury, and endure. Still, she picked up the hatchet. The first cut was quiet. The bale came apart like bread left too long in the sun. Loose, soft, defeated, she tore into it with her sons at her side. Mayra helped, hauling chunks into the compost pit. Donley stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with arms crossed, nodding every few minutes like a witness at a funeral. It took 3 days to dismantle the ring. On the 3rd day, the circle was gone, but the outline remained, a ring of bare, dark soil where no grass had grown all winter. A perfect arc surrounding the cabin. You could still see where the snow had packed down, where the frost had curled back like a wounded animal. And Miriam did something no one expected. She planted flowers. Not wild prairie ones. She planted seeds saved in a glass jar from years ago. Zinnias, marigold, and a few cornflower bulbs someone had given her back when her husband still walked. She worked quietly, bent low, hands in soil that had once frozen so hard it split steel. Her boys helped, so did Mayra. Even Donley knelt once awkwardly to press a bulb into the dirt. She marked the spot where Clara had been buried with a flat stone, and on it she carved just one word: stayed. Not died, not lost, not gone. Stayed. Because that's what this place had done. Through every storm, every frost, every insult and loss, it had stayed. People kept coming, even after the hay was gone. They asked if they could take soil samples, or plant their own flowers, or just sit for a while. Some came to thank her, others just to look. Miriam never turned them away. By summer, the cabin was quiet. Again, the last of the guests had gone. The carpenters built shelters of their own. Jessamine, healed and grieving, had taken Clara's grave seeds and started a garden in Red Valley. Reports came in from across the territory. Circles in Colorado, hay walls in Montana, a sod berm in Nebraska that mimicked her design. They didn't call it Miriam's method. They called it the circle. And maybe that was better, because it was never about her. It was about refusing to freeze when no one came to help. It was about stacking something with your bare hands and not knowing if it would work, but doing it anyway. It was about staying. And years later, when people told stories about the Great Freeze of '82, they didn't talk about the number of deaths or the record lows. They talked about the widow, the one who built the first circle, the one who turned a hay wall into a promise, the one who stayed.